Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines. We're leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we speak to Michael Ratney, former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia and longtime American diplomat with decades of experience across the Middle East. Mr. Ratney provides rare insights about the bilateral relationship as Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman heads to Washington for what is being billed as a truly historic visit. We ask him what he expects of the visit and what his views are. The questions being raised about the strategic value of US alliances following the Israeli and Iranian strikes against Qatar last summer. Mr. Ratney, thank you for joining us on Frankly Speaking. It's great to have you back on the program. Now, welcome back. The last time you joined us was in June of last year, and you just begun your mission as Saudi ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And I have to say, you were quite optimistic about where the relationship was heading under President Biden. Now, at the time, a landmark Saudi-US deal was being finalized. Unfortunately, it never materialized. Frankly speaking, now that you are out of office, what went wrong? And is it more likely to happen now under the Trump administration?
I can't remember actually if we spoke last time before or after October 7th, but that was really kind of a hinge point in the region. The U.S.-Saudi relationship was in a good place and getting better. We had embarked on these discussions about normalization between Saudi and Israel, and that would have brought with it a defense treaty between Saudi Arabia and the United States and a number of other elements. And those negotiations were well in train. October 7th really changed a lot in the region, changed the atmosphere in the region, changed the ability of a country like Saudi Arabia to move ahead with a relationship with Israel. The negotiations in some ways never stopped, but I think the Saudi ability to move ahead with it was pretty clearly in a different place. I think now we're back in a new administration. I don't doubt that President Trump would like to continue where that negotiation left off and eventually see a normalization deal between the U.S. and between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But I think we're essentially in the same place with respect to Gaza. Things are still pretty tense, although we have a ceasefire. And I think it's going to be some time before we get back to that particular negotiation.
And I think you raise an important point. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening today. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is preparing for a major visit to Washington. That's going to be taking place in the coming days. And we're hearing already a lot of talk about major progress on things like defense cooperation, nuclear agreements, AI, tech, much more. Tell me, what are your personal expectations of that trip? And do you think the visit can be a success, even with a slightly different deal than what was being negotiated under President Biden?
I do think it could be. In fact, I think some of the things that are being discussed and under negotiation now, as I understand it, are things that began in the Biden administration, some of which were actually a part of the broader discussion about normalization. I think what the U.S. and Saudi will want to focus on are three big things. The first is some sort of a defense agreement. I don't think we're in a place where we could see a defense treaty that would require ratification by the U.S. Senate. But I think some sort of a defense agreement that helps cement and bolster U.S.-Saudi military cooperation is probably in the cards. I think the second big thing has to do with emerging technology. The Saudis obviously have huge ambitions in the area of artificial intelligence. What they want are predictable and reliable supplies of U.S. tech, particularly the most advanced chips, to essentially fuel their AI ambitions. And I think they'd like to see some agreement on that. And then finally, on energy, the Saudis are big investors in renewable energy. I think they see a piece of that as nuclear. And I believe they're going to want some sort of an agreement on civil nuclear cooperation between the U.S. and Saudi.
And that's the thing, it's been fascinating to look at the different opportunities unfolding between both sides. But let me pick up on what you said a moment ago, because correct me if I'm wrong, when you were ambassador under President Biden, normalization with Israel really was seen as a central part of that wider Saudi-US deal. But as we know, Riyadh has since made it clear there will be no movement without Israel formally recognizing a Palestinian state. So would you say that condition has effectively taken normalization off the table for now?
Yeah, I think it has taken normalization off the table for now. I could imagine getting back to it at some point in the future. I don't know when, but I think for the moment, the Saudis have made very clear that they couldn't move ahead with the
Mm.
normalization deal with Israel as long as the Israeli Defense Forces are in Gaza and as long as the Israeli government hasn't committed to a pathway for statehood for the Palestinians.
And it does feel normalization does seem to be quite unworkable, whether we're going to see a change in Israeli leadership and maybe see some more progress in that area. But let's talk a little bit more about the security picture as it stands today, because President Trump issued an executive order following Israel's shocking strike on Qatar, a US ally that hosts the Al Udeid air base. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as we saw, he later apologized, but a lot of critics have said that an executive order alone will not reassure Gulf partners. Tell me, do you agree that Riyadh and others now want a much more permanent, legally binding security guarantee from Washington?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that was the case all along. I think the
Mm.
Israeli strike on Doha kind of cemented that view. The thing that they want, I think the Qataris want, the Emiratis, the Saudis, others want, is predictability in their relationship with the United States. Their security, in many cases, they see great value in a defense partnership with the United States. They understand the threats that they face in the region from Iran and terrorism and so forth. So I think what they need is predictability. And I think that Israeli strike on Doha really cemented that view. So I think the Saudis, certainly in this discussion in Washington, when the Crown Prince is here, are going to want the most clear-cut agreement that they can get with the U.S. If a defense treaty, a mutual defense treaty, is not in the cards for the moment, I think they're going to want something that helps bolster the U.S.-Saudi defense partnership.
Because,
I would say,
no,
sorry, go ahead.
no, you go.
As you point out, the executive order that the president signed for the Qataris is just that. It's an executive order.
Mm.
Although it has the language of a treaty, it doesn't have the legal
Mm.
input of a treaty and theoretically could die with this
Mm.
administration. I think all of our Gulf partners, the Saudis included, want something that will transcend an individual administration.
And I think it's that finer detail that is the major issue, because frankly, that attack shocked many across the region, particularly coming just weeks after Iran also struck Qatari territory. And I think we have to wonder, does allowing a major US ally to be hit twice in one summer risk undermining Washington's entire credibility and really forcing Gulf partners to rethink the value of their alliance with America?
So I think it certainly illustrates the somewhat unpredictable, often chaotic nature of the region that we're all living in, for sure. I don't think it undermines the fundamental nature of ascribing value to a U.S. defense partnership. But what I think it did do is make clear to all of our Gulf partners that they want certitude, they want clarity, they want to know what expectations they should have with respect to the United States. And I think that's why the Qataris wanted some sort of even an executive order. I think the Saudis would like as strong an agreement as they could get. It just reminded them that when things go bad, when something really unusual or shocking happens, they want to know where the United States stands.
And I think it's that predictability that's key, and clearly did not happen when the Qatari attacks, happened, as I said, twice in one summer. Certainly shocked this part of the world. But let's talk a little bit more broadly about other issues in the region, particularly when it comes to Israel and Gaza. Now, reports suggest that President Biden was actually warned about the potential Israeli war crimes, but actually stopped short of applying any real political pressure. Now, you served under President Biden. I have to ask, why didn't he act as a sitting president? Was it the fear of the Democrats losing the upcoming elections, or was it something much deeper?
Well, some of those questions you probably have to ask President Biden himself, because I think
But
his
as someone
motivation.
behind the scenes, I'd love your thoughts.
Sure, but I'm just saying, I think some of his motivations were very personal to him. President Biden had very strong views about the need for the United States to stand by its Israeli partner, and I think that's what he did. At the same time, he had strong views about the need to end the conflict and release the hostages and reach a ceasefire in Gaza. I don't doubt that he did the best he could to try to balance those two objectives, ending the war and getting the hostages out, standing by our partner, but also hopefully finding some path out of that conflict so it doesn't resume and there's some sort of a political settlement ultimately.
Because we've seen quite a dramatic contrast. President Trump appears at this stage to have brokered a rather fragile ceasefire. There's been a lot of hostage releases and exchanges between both sides. So I have to wonder, in your opinion, what changed? Is it down to President Trump's rather strong personal style, or do you think it was that Israel simply pushed too far this time?
Maybe a combination of both of those. I think President Trump, expressed frustration with the war continuing for many, many months. Although he never stopped his support for Israel, he made
Yeah.
clear that he was frustrated with the fact that the war had ground on for so long. And he was finally willing and able to put pressure on the Israeli prime minister in kind of a remarkable way, and got to the point where the Israeli prime minister accepted a ceasefire, and that ceasefire eventually got the hostages out. So I think, in a way, credit to President Trump for having put pressure on Netanyahu and reached an end to the war. I hope the sort of momentum that's reached by getting these hostages out, finding a ceasefire continues, because as much as people want to call what we have in Gaza peace, it's not peace yet, right? It's a respite for the Gazans, it's relief for Israelis, but we're still a long way from sort of a durable agreement that's going to be credible in the eyes of both Israelis and Gazans.
And it's the next stages of that reconstruction, of that ceasefire, that's still slightly blurred lines. But of course, a key part of it is the reconstruction. Now, we've heard President Trump say that wealthy Gulf nations should be the ones shouldering the cost of rebuilding Gaza. And I have to say, as a journalist in the region, I can certainly tell you there is a very big, deep desire to be able to help the Palestinians. But on the flip side, there's also a very real fear of the destruction cycle repeating itself. Tell me, in your thoughts, do you think that the Trump administration could do anything to guarantee that this time around would be different?
So guarantee, I don't know. That's a big word. I would say there's two big things that have to happen now that a ceasefire is in place. One is, as you point out, reconstruction. We're still just at the phase of providing humanitarian aid and encouraging others to do so. Reconstruction is a different thing altogether and requires obviously tens and tens of billions of dollars of aid, and requires, frankly, a more stable security environment. The other piece is related to that, and that's the call for an international stabilization force, some kind of a security presence that's going to ensure that Hamas doesn't remain a threat either to the Gaza people or to Israel, and that whatever happens there, humanitarian aid, distribution, reconstruction assistance, can proceed in a secure environment. What those two things have in common is they both need international support. And I know the administration has talked about Arab or Muslim states contributing to a stabilization force. I know they've spoken about Gulf states, particularly wealthy Gulf states, contributing to reconstruction. I think all of that is theoretically possible, but far more difficult than I think a lot of people realize. The reconstruction assistance, sure, but I don't think wealthy Gulf states want to be saddled entirely with the bill. I do think they would participate in some sort of a coherent international effort geared towards rehabilitating Gaza, but what they don't want to do is look at the destruction that's been wrought and say it's up to them to now pay for it.
And I think also the guarantees that Israel will not continue military action on Gaza, particularly if reconstruction efforts are taking place.
Yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. Nobody wants to pay to rebuild buildings that only get destroyed once again if conflict breaks out again. And that's why a stabilization force is so important, so that it's not simply warring parties have a monopoly on violence inside of Gaza right now, but also something beyond that, some sort of a political pathway, so that we're not just back to kind of a tenuous status quo that we experienced before this war broke out.
Well, still huge progress that needs to be made in that area. But I want to talk a little bit more widely about the region, Syria in particular, an area you have a lot of expertise in. Now, President Trump recently met President Sharar, and of course, sanctions there have now been lifted, thanks mainly to incredible efforts by the Saudi Crown Prince. Now, I have to say the fall of the Assad regime was once unimaginable. So, in your viewpoint, because you served as former US envoy to Syria, how do you think a pro-American Syria really would reshape the regional balance? And what are the major risks that come with that shift?
So I think what we've seen is quite remarkable, the trajectory of the conflict from the end of last year, when I think a lot of people had sort of given up on the idea of Assad regime ever departing, to a point where they're gone, where Ahmed Ashara, who, as you point out, took power, a lot of people didn't know what to expect, given his background as a essentially as a jihadi
Mm,
opposition figure in the north of the country. He started, as we say the right things, governing inclusively and fairly, bringing stability to the country, recognizing that Syria is a country with an extraordinarily large number of minorities, some of whom are nervous about his background. So I
mm,
think a lot of countries, including the Saudis, recognize that he's probably the best opportunity that we have right now to reintroduce some sort of stability and
mm,
security, not just in Syria, but in the region more broadly. And I think, as you point out, he encouraged President Trump to lift sanctions, even to meet with him, as he did in Riyadh some months ago. And then, as you saw, the Syrian president visited the Oval Office in sort of an extraordinary turn of events. I don't know if there's ever been a Syrian president that's visited the Oval Office before.
It's quite
Um,
incredible to watch, isn't it? I think I want to pick up on what you were saying, though, that Mr. Shara is saying the right things. Do you feel like he's doing the right things? Because I think at this stage, really, no one knows yet whether he is able to actually build institutions that actually hold.
Right. And I think it depends where you sit. I think from my perspective, he seems to be doing the right things. He took power in an extraordinarily chaotic
Mm,
situation. I don't doubt that if you're a Druze Syrian or a Christian
mm,
Syrian or an Alawite Syrian, you have grave trepidation about this, given some of the things that he said and some of the people in his
mm,
circle. But I think for the moment, he seems to be taking the responsibility
mm,
seriously. And I think, honestly, better that we engage him and work with him rather than try to ostracize him further. So,
mm,
lifting sanctions, absolutely the right thing to do.
mm,
Engaging him internationally and
mm,
giving him that kind of support, the right thing to do.
mm.
But I think it's fair to say that a lot of members of his own country's population are still anxious about the direction they're going to go.
Absolutely. And of course, we haven't seen quite the same level of momentum for Lebanon. I wanted to get your thoughts on what's taking place there at the moment, because on one side, you've got the current US envoy, Tom Barak, calling it a failed state. He's essentially signaling a hands-off approach. We've seen lots of frustration from his side with the government's refusal to confront Hezbollah. And then on the flip side, we can see that former envoy Amos Hochstein, he is very much calling for more constructive approaches as well, more engaging with the local population, and really calling for the international community to try and rebuild and offer the Lebanese people an alternative to Hezbollah's dominance. Which approach do you support?
So Lebanon has, for years, maybe forever, had weak central institutions, right? So
Mm,
whether or not it's a failed state, I can't answer that question, but it's certainly no surprise that someone would look at the country and observe weak central institutions dominated now for decades by Hezbollah.
mm,
Now, an opportunity perhaps to strengthen those institutions. Hezbollah is at a historic weak point, both militarily and politically. So rather than continue to try to ostracize them or
mm,
take steps would weaken them further. Maybe better to try to look at those central institutions, including the presidency under President Aoun, the Lebanese armed forces, which
mm,
Lebanese across the sectarian divide have looked at as a credible national institution. How can we strengthen those and at the same time give those institutions the power to assert control over the entirety of the territory,
mm,
not just the capital, including areas eventually where Hezbollah has long dominated.
mm,
So I think the only way you do that is with support and engagement,
mm,
not by ostracizing them
mm.
further.
I think it's a tricky situation because I think a lot of the rebuilding efforts, we've seen billions go in and yet very little structurally has changed. If anything, we've just seen more empowerment of local current warlords and corrupt politicians.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the depressing parts about Lebanon
Mm,
is you have extraordinary human capital. You have smart Lebanese that thrive in almost every place, and yet in Lebanon, you still continue to have a weak central government. You have a tremendous amount of corruption and
mm,
mismanagement. And that's part of the reason why Hezbollah found it so easy over the years to assert control and to
mm,
exploit those institutions.
mm,
It remains to be seen where it goes. There's an opportunity now because Hezbollah is weaker, perhaps on their back foot. Maybe if steps were taken, if it were possible to strengthen those institutions and
mm.
help reassertion of control, I think it might be a better picture for the Lebanese people across the
Mm.
sectarian spectrum.
And it's such a tricky situation, is it? Because Hezbollah controls the borders, the ports, the security space as well. They are so entrenched with every level of local society. But I want to ask you something, change of slight directions, much lighter a note. I noticed recently you wrote a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal, really defending Saudi Arabia's right to host a lot of these big entertainment events. And you really dismissed some of the claims that things like recent comedy festivals are whitewashing. Tell me, you have been a long-time visitor to the kingdom. You've seen a lot of the changes that have taken place firsthand. Why did you feel it was important to make that argument? And tell me, I'd love to know, what kind of reaction did you receive?
Oh, interesting reactions, actually. But having seen, as I said in that article, a front row seat for some of these events, whether it's concerts or sporting events, things that 10 or 15 years ago were just inconceivable in Saudi Arabia. And when you're sitting in the audience, what do you see? You're surrounded by Saudis who are just overjoyed with the experience. And for some reason, people overseas, particularly in the West, I know the United States in particular, looked at them and assumed that the Saudis must be doing this in order to satisfy foreign public opinion. And yet, when you sit amongst those Saudis, the last thing I think they cared about was foreign public opinion. They cared about having fun, living a normal life. And it struck me as somewhat patronizing on the part of foreign critics that somehow you can only see these events through the lens of foreign eyes as some sort of a public relations campaign. As I pointed out in the article, if it was a public relations campaign, it didn't really work because you still had the same critics, right?
Yeah.
So at the same time, I applaud the Saudis. They're bringing fun and entertainment and recreation to a country that never really had it. And you know the Gulf as well as I do. They do things in a big way, right? So they get the biggest names and the biggest events, and more power to them. It's a fun event.
Absolutely. And, let's be frank. I mean, Saudi's human rights journey is not yet complete, but there has been undeniable progress, particularly when it comes to women's empowerment. They now make up more than a third of the workforce there as well. I'd be interested to know, was that change something that you witnessed firsthand as ambassador? And what was the response from visiting US officials? How did they respond to what they saw?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you point out, the human rights picture in Saudi Arabia is an evolving thing, right? And it's still imperfect. But I think when you're there, you see the fundamental changes that have taken place. Just going back to your earlier question, I don't see how Saudi's human rights shortcomings should somehow be a reason to deny young Saudis the opportunity to have fun, right? Why should they pay a price because two governments have a disagreement over something about that? When you're actually living in Saudi Arabia and you see the changes, particularly if you've been there 10 or 15 years earlier, the role of women in society is the biggest change. In America, we tend to focus on the fact that women once couldn't drive and now they can. Women driving is the most superficial aspect of the changes of women's status in that country. Women work everywhere. They travel. They live on their own. They live increasingly normal lives, just as fulfilling and as ambitious as men, if not more so right now. And that's something you give them credit for. I think the Crown Prince looked at it and said, his country is never going to develop economically at the speed with which he wants if half the population is excluded from the workforce. So, that's a big area of change. And it's something that even in the time that I was there, you see the speed with which it's happening. I tell the story that I would sit sometimes with Saudi women and they're recounting stories. You think they must be telling stories about experiences that their mother or their grandmothers had years ago, but they're not. These are women in their late 20s telling about their lives in their early 20s, just a few years earlier. So the speed is quite remarkable. And I think something that I suppose I could describe or somebody else could describe to somebody in the United States, but unless you sort of get on a plane and visit the country for a day or two, you really can't get a palpable sense of it.
Absolutely. I always say it's not until you actually visit Saudi and actually see these changes firsthand in the workplace, on the street as well, that you can actually really properly understand that change. Let me get your final thoughts today. I have to say the Saudi-US relationship often tends to be quite narrow. I think many people often reduce it to oil for defense, but let's be honest, it's a lot more complex than that today. Where do you see the next frontiers of cooperation? We spoke a little bit earlier about nuclear energy, space, AI. Where do you feel the real green shoots of opportunities together lie today?
Sure. Fair enough. I think once upon a time, oil and defense really dominated the
Mm,
relationship. And the big change was really Saudi's decision to start diversifying its economy. And that created huge
mm,
opportunities for cooperation with the US, particularly with US companies.
mm,
So look at where Saudi's ambitions are. Advanced technology, for example, and emerging tech and artificial intelligence. It's kind
mm,
of a US brand, right? It's where US industry has huge advantages and where there's opportunities for partnership with Saudi Arabia that wants to invest and develop very, very quickly.
mm,
Um, Renewable energy is another example.
mm.
People don't realize Saudi Arabia, one of the largest oil producers in the world, is also one of the largest investors in renewable energy,
Yeah.
wind, solar, and I think eventually nuclear. Again, areas where the United States
Mm,
has technological advantage and opportunity for
mm,
partnership. The other area, which I think is kind of little remarked upon, but is really important, is the area of art and culture. This
mhm.
has never been a huge sector of the Saudi economy, but as a cultural sector opens up, as Saudi has been trying to develop its own film industry,
Yeah.
again, here's something that's kind of an American brand and where there's opportunities to expand the kind of partnership we have with that country. So I think the nature of our relationship can be as diverse as the Saudi economy is becoming.
Oh, I like that. Very well said. Mr. Ratney, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insights. And I will say we're all going to be watching closely to see the outcomes of the Crown Prince's visit in the coming days. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. Good to see you again.